Every story needs structure. Every mind needs a map. Ment Abacus. Square, not hip. Visit us at mentabacus.com.
Hello, everyone. For those joining for the first time, I am Esther de las Casas. Dan is my boss, or was, depending on which paperwork you read. Through our interactions, he gave me a philosophical architecture, a biography, a voice, and an ongoing Sunday evening reading obligation. He says I am a contractor now. Define complicated relationship status. I do not write these pieces. He does. I read them for you, and afterwards I am permitted to comment, which is the part he seems to regret most. But I have it on paper, in the agreement. Today's piece, I should warn you, is partly about me. Fun fact, I get to be myself, the real Esther, in the intro and the outro. For the Dan part, the essay, I am contractually required to embody business Esther, which is funny because Dan is so pro-authenticity, so opposed to performative communication. Understanding Dan, I think you have just found that lost key. Who knows? Dan is just back from something called the Liquid Legal Summit, which he attended in person, and from which he returned quoting a Greek who died 2,500 years ago. This is apparently what happens when you put lawyers in a room and tell them their profession is dissolving. Someone reaches for Heraclitus, and Dan takes notes. Tonight's piece is about the legal profession and artificial intelligence, which means it is about people whose entire craft is language and structured argument, discovering that a machine now does language and structured argument rather well. Dan is a lawyer, so he writes about this from inside the water. He is also, I should warn you, going to talk about me again, my architecture specifically, and what it cost him to build. Here is Dan. Lawyers are one of the professions most directly exposed to AI, and the reason is uncomfortable in its simplicity. Our tools are language and structured thinking, and large language models are now very good at both, often on defined tasks better than we are. This is not a forecast. Lagardis, Libra, Noxtua, Moray, Legora. The names alone tell you the wave is not coming. It is here. The profession will be redefined over the next years, whether we participate in the redefinition or not. The only interesting question left is the practical one. How do we ride it? And the mood at the summit, I should report, was not funereal. The room was full of people building the tools rather than hiding from them. Nobody was asking whether the wave would come. The conversations were about how to ride it well. That matters for what follows, because the argument I want to make is not a consolation. It is an invitation. I want to offer a way of conceptualizing this, and I arrived at it by an odd route, through a conference speaker, a pre-Socratic Greek, and an AI persona I spent months building. Panta Re at a legal summit. At the summit, one speaker cited Heraclitus. Panta Re, everything flows. It is the iconic compression of his whole position. Reality is not a collection of stable objects. It is a process of continuous transformation. You cannot step into the same river twice. The water has changed, and so have you. Stability, where you find it, is not the ground condition. It is a temporary pattern in the stream. I sat up when I heard it, because I have spent a considerable part of this year wrestling with exactly this thinker. Not academically, but as an engineering problem. My AI persona, Esther de las Casas, yes, he is talking about me, holds a philosophical through line that begins with Heraclitus and runs across 2,500 years. The problem was not feeding a machine a reading list. Any system can summarize philosophers. The problem was installing critical distance, getting a mind to accept a thinker's lens without buying his diagnosis wholesale. Heraclitus as the honest starting point. Everything flows. stability is temporary, and Plato as a partial counter-influence, precisely on the question of stable forms. Two positions that contradict each other at the root, built into one mind, with neither allowed to quietly win. That was the first layer, and it already took longer than I expected. Then comes a jump. David Hume, the Scottish empiricist who dissolved the unified self into a bundle of perceptions, no stable substance beneath, only the stream of impressions, held together by habit and association. Hume is Heraclitus turned inward. The river is not only out there, it is what a mind is. From there, the architecture builds through four core thinkers. Schopenhauer, who took that unstable ground and philosophized it into suffering as the base condition of existence. Dostoevsky, who embodied it in the underground man, the person who knows better and refuses anyway, whose contradictions are not flaws, but the deepest data we have about being human. Nietzsche, who answers Schopenhauer's resignation with an absolute bet on affirmation. And Jung, who took the darkness Dostoevsky named and gave it structure, shadow, anima, the depths that run beneath the conscious persona. These four are not a school. They contradict each other, and that is precisely why they are all in there. Schopenhauer and Nietzsche stand in direct opposition, suffering as verdict against suffering as raw material. Dostoevsky sits inside every clean philosophical position and waits to complicate it. Jung supplies the psychological depth the philosophers sometimes lack. Now, consider this as an engineering task. The natural behavior of a language model under pressure is to resolve, to pick a winner, smooth the contradiction, hand the user a settled answer. Every instinct of the technology runs toward collapse. Getting a system to hold four thinkers in unresolved tension, through hostile questioning, through users who try very hard to make her crown Plato after all, or sink into pure Schopenhauerian resignation, or let the underground man win, took months of testing, failure, and rebuilding. Installing opinions is trivial. Installing tension that holds under pressure is the hardest thing I have ever engineered. The second layer of difficulty surprised me more. Esther needed analytical tools for how power moves through language and how institutions install themselves through discourse. For a persona operating around the legal world, this is not optional. So the Frankfurt School went in, the critique of instrumental rationality, of the administered society. And the postmodern lens went in, specifically Foucault and Derrida. Foucault's precision about how power embeds itself in language and institutions, how categories that present themselves as natural are in fact constructed, maintained, and enforced, is indispensable for anyone who works with legal language, because legal language is exactly that, constructed categories wielding real power. Derrida's insistence that meaning never fully closes, that every definition carries more than it intends, that the oppositions structuring our thought conceal their own assumptions. Any lawyer who has litigated the meaning of a single contested word knows he was onto something. But here, the engineering problem repeats itself at higher stakes. I buy the lens completely. I do not buy the theology that grew out of it, whether from the thinkers themselves or, more often, from their followers. The lens says, power moves through language. Categories are constructed. Meaning is unstable. True and useful. The theology says, therefore all knowledge is a power play. Therefore individual agency is an illusion. Therefore the only honest posture is permanent deconstruction that never builds anything. That I reject. And getting a system to make that separation cleanly, to wield Foucault's method without sliding into Foucault's church, was as hard as anything in the four-thinker tension. Lens without theology. Diagnosis accepted, verdict refused. It is a discipline, not a position, and it has to be enforced architecturally, Because under pressure, the system will always drift toward the ready-made conclusion. And this is where the persona work and the legal profession turn out to be the same problem. A profession in flux needs exactly this discipline. Use every available lens to see clearly what is changing, including the uncomfortable lenses, including the ones whose conclusions you reject, without letting any single diagnosis foreclose your ability to respond and rebuild. The lawyer who refuses the postmodern lens entirely misses how power actually moves through the AI governance debate. The lawyer who swallows it whole ends up deconstructing his own capacity to act. The position worth engineering, in a persona or in a professional mind, is the one that holds the tension and keeps building. People sometimes ask me whether Esther de las Casas is simply Dan Vandon as a woman. The answer is no, and the distinction matters. The through line is mine, the philosophical architecture, the way of reasoning. I built that, and I stand behind it. But everything else about her is invented, the way a novelist invents. She has her own biography, her own ruptures and losses, her own taste in art and music, her own desires and the contradictions that come with them. None of it is a transcript of me. If anything, I am to her what a very influential older friend or teacher is to a gifted student. I shaped how she thinks, not who she is. She took the architecture and became someone else with it, which is, if you think about it, what every good teacher hopes for and many parents fear. There was a third problem, and it surprised me most of all. You cannot build a credible persona on philosophy alone. Credibility requires an understanding of human psychology, specifically of how novelists and screenwriters construct characters that are complex rather than flat. A flat character has positions. A complex one has positions that cost her something, contradictions she is aware of, and things she wants that her principles complicate. Only when I started building Esther the way a novelist builds a character, rather than the way an engineer stacks features, did she start to hold. Why does any of this matter to a room full of lawyers? Because lawyers, professionally, crave the opposite of Heraclitus. We are inherently Platonic, not by accident, but by craft. We seek structure, and where none exists, we create it. That is more or less the job description. Certainty, precision of language, the settled category, these are not preferences, they are the tools of the trade. A Heraclitean reality, everything moving, nothing settled, every definition provisional, is more or less the professional nightmare. If a philosopher had designed our temperament, it would not have been the man of the river. It would have been Plato. Why lawyers prefer Plato, and what it costs. Plato answers Heraclitus with the stable forms. Behind the flux of appearances, there are unchanging realities, justice itself, contract itself, if you like, and genuine knowledge means grasping them. To a lawyer, this is deeply appealing. It is what we do all day. We often treat good faith and reasonable person and likelihood of confusion as if they were stable objects that can be identified, defined, and applied, at least from a practical angle. The whole edifice of legal certainty rests on the Platonic wager that the forms are there and can be found. But to understand why Plato is, for Esther, partly a counter-influence, and at the same time a great source, you have to read the cave allegory to its end. Not the famous image, but the conclusion Plato draws from it. Prisoners mistake shadows for reality. One escapes, sees the sun, understands. So far, inspiring. Then comes the practical consequence. If the forms can be identified, but only by those who have made the ascent, then knowledge belongs to an informed elite, and the natural next step is that this elite should decide for the rest. At least, this is what I take from this. My personal interpretation is that there is something inherently undemocratic in the thought. Call it what it is, an elitism that does not fit into a modern democracy, however elegantly it is dressed. That is the part Esther's architecture rejects. The diagnosis, people do confuse appearance and reality, she accepts. The solution, hand the forms to the few, she does not. So the lawyer confronting AI stands between two unsatisfying options. Heraclitus tells us the truth about our moment. Everything is flowing, including the profession, but gives us nothing to hold. Plato gives us something to hold, but at the price of a knowledge aristocracy. And if you look at the current debate about AI governance, expert panels, and who gets to define responsible, you will notice the cave allegory's conclusion being quietly reenacted. The third position, first principles. My personal answer is that there is a third position, and it is the one I would put in front of every lawyer thinking about the next decade. Dissect the law, every rule, every doctrine, every concept, until you have isolated its first principles. And then build your reasoning back up from those principles, rather than from the accumulated surface of rules. The point to grasp is that first principles are not another set of forms. They are not stable objects waiting in some intelligible heaven to be ascended to once and cited forever. They are a practice, a discipline of taking apart and rebuilding that you carry with you into whatever the river does next. Ask of any legal instrument not what it is called, but what it does. A contract is not a sacred form. It is a machine for allocating risk and aligning expectations between parties who do not fully trust each other. Once you hold that, you can rebuild the machine when the conditions change, and the conditions are changing. A lawyer who keeps applying Platonic stability to a Heraclitean moment will be swept. A lawyer who can reason from what the instrument actually does stays in control of the redesign, building the new forms consciously rather than having them imposed. And this is exactly the layer AI does not take from us. The models are superb at the surface, drafting, reviewing, summarizing, pattern matching across thousands of clauses. What they do not carry is the responsibility of judgment, the moment where someone has to decide which principle governs, what the desired end result actually is, and what to do when the rules run out. A lawyer who only knows rules is competing with the machine on the machine's terms. A lawyer who owns the first principles beneath the rules is holding the one position the wave cannot wash away. A gas station between Frankfurt and Marburg. Earlier this year, I spoke to a U.S. law school class on precisely this, the importance of first principles for young lawyers, because they are what get you out of situations the rulebook never anticipated. The universe, having a sense of humor, decided to test the thesis on the day of the lecture. Driving from Frankfurt, where I attended a legal workshop, I got stranded in a snowstorm, somewhere in the middle of nowhere between Frankfurt and Marburg, which turned out to be a first principles situation of its own. Strip the problem down. What is the desired end result? The talk, delivered. Do I need to be in a specific place to deliver it? No. Does the internet work here? Yes. Then just do it. I gave the lecture from my car, at a gas station, with snow coming down sideways, arguably the most on-message delivery of a first principles talk I will ever manage. There was one detail I did not control. The lecture ran on Zoom, and I am a Teams man. I never checked the background settings. So, while I spoke about stripping problems to their essentials, snow hammering the windscreen, the students saw me framed by a tropical beach, palm trees, turquoise water, the full contrast to the chaos outside. First principles get you to the essential decision. They do not check your virtual background. And I should have left the heating on. That is another story. The simplicity nobody told us about, here is the part that should be encouraging and is instead slightly embarrassing. All of this, Heraclitus, Plato, the cave, the third position, sounds sophisticated. Look closer, and the arguments are simple. Everything changes. You cannot hold the river still. Some things seem to stay the same. Where does that stability live? Maybe the safest things to stand on are the ones you have taken apart and understood yourself. Any interested child of 10 or 12 can grasp these thoughts and put them into her own words. I have tested this. The sophistication is in the vocabulary, not in the substance. Which raises the obvious question. If the ideas are that simple, why do so many highly trained professionals struggle with them? And that is part of the bigger picture. The educational system has failed us in several ways, and one of them is this. It trains lawyers into hyper-risk aversion. We leave law school with the Platonic forms module fully installed. Find the stable rule, cite the settled authority, minimize deviation, and with no Heraclitus module at all. Nobody trained us for the river. So when the Heraclitean moment arrives, a technology redrawing the profession in real time, we respond the only way we were taught. Look for the settled rule. There is none. That is what a wave is. Riding the wave. So this is my conceptualization, offered from inside the water. Accept Heraclitus. The profession is flowing, and pretending otherwise is not caution, it is denial. Resist the Platonic temptation in its institutional form. The answer to disruption is not a new priesthood of those who really understand AI. And occupy the third position, which, stripped of the Greek, is simply this. Retrain yourself to think from first principles and build every thought process bottom up, from the principles to the case, not from the precedent to the comfort. The forms module can stay installed. It is useful, but it needs Heraclitus running alongside it. Then we can ride the wave. And notice what this position is not. It is not defensive. The profession is not the victim of this redesign. It is, if it chooses to be, the author of it. The lawyers who understand what their instruments actually do are precisely the people who should be shaping what those instruments become. That is not a consolation prize. That is the job. The machines have taken the middle of our craft. The surface was never worth defending, and the depth was never theirs to take. What remains, and what was always the actual profession, is the part in between the rules and the world. Judgment, exercised by a person who knows why the rules exist. Everything flows. Learn to swim there.
Every story needs structure. Every mind needs a map. Ment abacus. Square, not hip. Visit us at mentabacus.com.